interpret social meaning out of that context and what the meaning is to the participants, to the informants. So the construction of meaning as it is done in the research field is the most important thing you get at with ethnography. And then, of course, you use different survey methods, not only interviews, not only participant observation, but a lot more, document analysis, and so on and so forth. Also very important, there is no standardized set of methodology. The methods you use depend on the content matter. It depends on what you want to find out. It depends on the conditions of the field. So it's flexible. So you use a whole lot of different methods and you arrange it according to the necessities in the field. That's very important because if people come from a quantitative research, they are used to have a setup of methods they have to use, have to follow, certain criteria they have to make sure to be followed. That's not the case in qualitative studies. It's the subjectivity that's in the foreground, and many experience this as kind of a burden. It's the burden of authorship, as many researchers have called it. And well, there is no way out of this. It all depends on the subjective researcher, what he or she is doing in the field. So, and last but not least, how to secure, as in quantitative research, validity and reliability. In qualitative research, it's credibility and dependability. Most important of that, you make everything transparent you're doing. What kind of theories, what kind of framing you choose, what kind of methods, and why, and what's the advantage and disadvantage. Everything has to be put in the open. You have to make it transparent. You reflect on that. You triangulate with the use of different methods, of course, and you make the so-called member check. That means you get your informants as kind of participants in your research, and you get feedback from your informants. Next slide, please. This might be an interesting publication from Blomert and G doing ethnographic fieldwork. What is also very interesting in this volume is that the second edition, a new chapter on the ethnography in an online world. Because I think ethnography in the online world is very important now in ethnographic research. I go a little bit more into detail now in the next paragraph. Okay, next slide, please. Ethnography in Germany, actually the term ethnography was coined in Germany already in the 1740s. It's about the national diversity in the world. And this goes back to the philosopher Herder, who had some very interesting ideas about the so-called Volksgeist. It's a unique spirit every people or every nation owns, and the characteristics of nations are based on this so-called Volksgeist. And to find out about this was the starting point for various disciplines to get an idea of what this Volksgeist means and what it leads to. So for instance, the so-called Völkerpsychology, which is one of the founding pillars for cultural anthropology and especially also for intercultural communication, and especially Wilhelm Wundt, did many comparative studies in this field. Of course, this is outdated nowadays. This is very old-fashioned stuff, but still, those are the roots where ethnography actually comes from. And with the ideas of Herders and the Völker psychology, Franz Boas, the German geographer who moved for research to North America and happened to be the founding father of cultural anthropology in the United States. And therefore, the paradigm of cultural relativism, that each people's special cultural characteristics are of the same value, basically. So it's an anti-program to racism. At that time, at the beginning, at the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, racist science was on the foreground. And actually, the ideas coming from Herder, the Völker psychology, Boas' new cultural anthropology was very much against the racist found basic racic-based science at that time. So the cultural relativism paradigm also is one of the main and central ideas of intercultural communication. Ethnography in Germany up to the 1950s was mainly only used in the cultural sciences, which are two disciplines, Volkskunde and Ethnology in Germany. And from the 1950s on, it's been used in various disciplines. So it's a method that is unique in its usefulness for the research, for doing research in very, very many research fields. Next slide, please. So the ethnography of communication was introduced by Del Hymes and John Gumpertz to US American anthropologists and linguists. And what of course is important in this approach is the fusion of anthropology and linguistics, so that everything you do in linguistics is seen in a wider context. And that opened new perspectives for linguistics and also for anthropology. Anthropology used to not really focus on language itself, but with the studies of Hymes and Gumpertz, they started to do this. And also the pragmatic linguistics and sociolinguistics that came from those studies, Gumpertz and Hymes, opened new perspectives in doing research in this field, and especially also for intercultural communication. Important, of course, is how is language used in certain situations in specific social contexts. And therefore, you have to be knowledgeable about the sociocultural rules and norms and values that guide behavior of people in those situations. Next slide, please. So now, the challenges of ethnography during the pandemic. Now, the current situation in Europe is actually very bad. In all the European countries, we face a second wave of the pandemic. And this second wave is much worse than the first one in March and April. So that means lots of problems for hospitals, for nursing homes, and so on and so forth. So therefore, most of European societies talk about a radical lockdown, which has started already in many countries and is about to start at the latest after Christmas. Of course, there's a special problem with Christmas. People want to visit their families and everybody wants to come together. Now, this will be hard for many, many people in Europe to celebrate Christmas as they were used to celebrate. And not to mention many other things like skiing resorts Europeans like to go skiing. There are millions of skiers in the wintertime. Now, up to the mid of January, skiing resorts are closed. So that's a big problem for many people. And of course, the business problems that follows from all that, and so on and so forth. But what is important for us is there are limits, of course, to doing qualitative research, because it means face-to-face research most of the time. So it's interesting to think about what is the alternative